I apologize for the feedback in the audio. This is a USB device, and I haven't taken the time to try to eliminate the feedback by tweaking the audio. So again, I apologize. Thank you for joining 2x3. This video is on the Devine name, its use and meaning. Now, a lot of people say God has many names. Some people say God has 99 names. There is not one scripture in the Bible that says God has many names. There is not one scripture in the Bible that says God has 99 names. There is not one occasion in history where God has said He had many names. He has never claimed to have many names. We're going to talk about who named God, what is His name, why don't we see it in the book that bears His name, or that should bear His name. Alright, the title of this chapter is called The Devine Name, Its Use and Its Meaning. You see, in your copy of the Bible, how is Psalms 83:18 translated? In the King James Version, it says that thou may know. It says that man may know that thou, whose name alone is Jehovah, art the Most High over all the earth. In the New World Translation of the Holy Scriptures, it renders this verse this way: that people may know that you, whose name is Jehovah, you alone are the Most High over all the earth. Another number of the Bible translations give a similar rendering. However, many translators leave out the name Jehovah. They replace it with titles such as Lord or Eternal or Elohim. But the question is, what belongs in that verse? And why did the translators choose not to place the name Jehovah there? Now, is Jehovah a name or a title? Let's find out. The verse that we just referenced, Psalms 83:18, speaks about a name. In the original Hebrew, which much of the Bible was written, anywhere from Matthew to Malachi, is all Hebrew Aramaic scriptures. It says a unique personal name appears here in this verse and in, practically 6,000 other verses. And it is spelled, and a little indication here. Now, you may not know that, but this is Hebrew. And it literally translates to the English letters YHWH. Now, I say English letters because, remember, that's Hebrew. In order for us to understand it, we have to use English letters. But those are the actual Hebrew letters. And they correlate with YHWH. Now, in English, the common rendering of the name is Jehovah. Why? Because the YHWH in English would be JHVH. Because that's how it would translate into English. Now, does that name occur in only one Bible verse? Not at all. You know, it appears in the original text of the Hebrew Scriptures over 7,000 times. I said 6,000 earlier because I was being conservative. But over 7,223 times God's name, Jehovah, appeared in the Bible. 7,223 times. Why did they take it out? Well, let's talk about that. How important is God's name? Well, consider the model prayer that Jesus gave. It begins this way. In the King James Version, it says, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Now, a lot of people don't know what hallowed means. It doesn't mean a hole in the middle of a log. It literally means, may the name be held up. May it be set apart. Notice, Our Father in the heavens, let your name be sanctified. The word sanctified translates into set apart. You see, later Jesus prayed to God. He said, Father, glorify your name. And in response, God spoke from heaven, saying, and this was interesting. You know, there are a lot of people out there who say Jesus is God. But if you go to this verse in John, in the 12th chapter, verse 27 through 29, you'll see that God is speaking from heaven to Jesus, His Son. But we'll talk about that belief in the duality and the Trinity. We'll talk about those beliefs later. But right now we're going to stick with God's name. Jesus asked his Father, he said, Father, glorify your name. And then his Father spoke from heaven, saying, I both glorified it and will glorify it again. You see, clearly, God's name is of utmost importance. So why then do so many translators leave this name out of their translations and replace it with titles such as God or Lord or Elohim? He has never asked anyone to alter the scriptures. And that's exactly what was done there 7,000 times in most Bibles. According to international law, translators of the Bible, because every Bible translator must be a part of a Bible society, and translators of a Bible are allowed to alter, literally alter, 500 scriptures. They don't have to follow the premise of what it originally said. They can alter it. They can change it to make it say whatever they want. We'll talk about some of those verses later. But for right now, we're going to continue with our subject here on why they took it out of the Bible. You see, there seems to be two main reasons. First, many claim that the name should not be used because the original way to pronounce it is unknown today. Now, let me digress. In ancient Hebrew, it was written without vowels, only consonants. That's why you see the YHVH, YHWH, or the JHVH. And so people say, well, since we don't know how to exactly pronounce it, then we shouldn't use it. But that's not true. There are several names in the Bible that have the name Jehovah attached to it. Many of the Israelites named their children after that name, using part of it as their child's name. We'll give you an example of a few. Jehoshaphat, Jehu, Joshua, Jeremiah, Joseph. All of these names indicate, when you look at the translation, something attributed to Jehovah. And then there were several other names where it didn't use the Jah in the name, but it all spoke of being attributed to Jehovah. Even the name Jesus, which is pronounced in Hebrew Yeshua, or Yeshua. It depends on the pronunciation. Or Yehoshua. You know, it is the same name for Joshua when pronounced in English. No one can say for certain how Jesus' name was originally pronounced. Yet, people the world over use different forms of the name Jesus, pronouncing it in a way that is common in their language. Now, none of us, when referring to Jesus, we refer to him as Yehoshua or Yeshua. We refer to him as Jesus because that's the English translation of the name. And I say translation, okay, not interpretation. Now, this creates no problems at all, since we have so many other Hebrew names that we know the pronunciation of today that are similar in spelling to the YHWH. So from there, especially with the name Jesus, no one can hesitate in the use of the name because they didn't know what the first century pronunciation was. Okay, if you travel to a foreign land, you might well find that your own name sounds quite different in another tongue. Hence, the name, let's take Juan, which is John, or let's take Jesus, which is Jesus, or let's do another Hispanic name, Jehovah, which is Jehovah. And then we'll do the last one, which is Jorge, George. That's the example that they're mentioning being pronounced in another tongue. Hence, uncertainty about the ancient pronunciation of God's name is no reason for not using it. As a matter of fact, too many scholars have worked on the name, and too many translators prior to the 16th century added the name with the correct spelling Jehovah. It is also on several coins of ancient times, several books, several publications. So many people spoke about that name. We're going to talk about it in a minute because of the tradition. This is the second reason that it is often omitted from the Bible, because there was a tradition among the Jews that God's name was so holy that, well, they basically told people that God's name should never be pronounced, because as being imperfect humans, we should never pronounce that name. But this was evidently based on a misapplication of what the Bible said. This was based on an interpretation as opposed to an understanding of what was really meant. In Exodus 27, it states, in essence, you must not take up the name of Jehovah your God in a worthless way, for Jehovah will not leave the one unpunished who takes up his name in a worthless way. There was nothing there about saying not to take up his name at all. It was, as brought out here, it forbade the misuse of God's name. It did not forbid the respectful use of the name. The writers of the Hebrew, the Old Testament, as we talked about the Old Covenant, were all faithful men who lived by the law of Jehovah that he had given to the ancient Israelites. And they made frequent use of the name. Again, 7,000 times. They included it in many of the psalms that were sung out loud by crowds of worshipers. Jehovah God even instructed his worshipers to call upon his name and faithful ones to obey it. Now we're going to take a brief look here at Joel 2:32, and I'm hoping that you can see that in the pop-up screen. And it must occur that everyone who calls on the name of Jehovah will get away safe. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there will prove to be the escaped ones, just as Jehovah has said, and in among the survivors whom Jehovah is calling. Now notice how the prophet Joel mentioned the name Jehovah 3 times in just one verse. Why? Because that name was important to those prophets. They knew. Listen to the scripture, how it says that everyone who calls on the name of Jehovah, certainly he would make sure that individuals would know how to pronounce his name in these days in which we are now living. There is no way in the world he would have let it go unpronounced for centuries. He would make sure that the pronunciation of the name was clear and definite. Because remember, his name is holy. As a matter of fact, Jesus asked him to glorify his name. He said, I both glorified it and will glorify it again. This is the glorification of his name, the pronouncing it properly. Again, it is not Jehovah as in J-A-H. It is G, J-E-H. The J has the G sound. Jehovah. Like Jesus, Jehu. So that's just to help certain people. Now, are we completely 100% certain? No, but we are at least 95% certain that the name is pronounced Jehovah. And again, we know that because of the other names of the Bible that are similar in spelling, that we can assimilate the vowels within the consonants. Okay, Acts 2:21, it says, and everyone who calls on the name of Jehovah will be saved. Now, it's interesting because here at 2x3, every scripture is backed up by at least 2 scriptures. Well, the scripture here at Joel 2:32, I'm going to take you to Acts 2:21 so that you can see. Acts 2:21, as it turns out, this is what the individual Peter was saying. It starts at verse number 16. He says, on the contrary, this is what was said through the prophet Joel. And in the last days, God says, I shall pour out some of my spirit upon every sort of flesh.